Thank you everyone for coming tonight or watching this via Zoom. Um, I guess, well, let's see, I've been around for 70 some years. And I'm a forest entomologist by training. And forest entomologists are really of two different types. You like to work with trees, but there's insects that colonize them, so you work with those. Or you like working with bugs and you got some that just happen to feed on trees. I'm of the first group. I was really more interested in forestry, forest ecology. And of course, since insects are one of those more important components, I got interested in that. So my heart is with the trees, if you will. But I certainly study insects as well as diseases. My role with South Dakota State University is as the extension forestry specialist. And so I travel the state working with that. And I'm also a professor here at South Dakota State University. So I teach, for example, forest ecology class, which we take students out quite frequently to the Black Hills. And then I also do work with the South Dakota Department of Ag and Natural Resources. But tonight, the hat that I'm wearing is actually with South Dakota State University. And I will say, I think I've spent more than half my life here now, or at least half my life here now, and I certainly enjoy the opportunity to live in South Dakota. Though I probably know every mile marker between Brookings and the Black Hills because during the summer I may be traveling that once a week, though I try to get out to the hills a little bit longer if I can. So with tonight, let me start out with this slide to kind of set the stage. And that's this. If the land mechanism as a whole is good, then every part of it is good, whether we understand it or not. But over the course of eons has built something we like but don't understand it, then who but a fool would discard seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. And so I'm not going to be talking about insect management tonight, at least a lot. We're not going to talk about what products are available to treat and various treatments, though I'll certainly entertain questions on it. But my part is the mountain pine beetle or all the bark beetles really are an integral part of the Black Hills. Why you occasionally do get people saying we need to get rid of them. Not only is that not possible, that's probably not useful because they're actually part of the system. So tonight's role more is talking about what they do as part of it and avoid terms like good and bad. They just are. Now, there are some that we might give those terms, and that would be emerald ash borer. Now, emerald ash borer has not been found in the Black Hills. We've not confirmed it there yet, but it has been confirmed in the counties that border the eastern edge of the state. And emerald ash borer, I don't mind using the word bad in the sense that it is not a native insect. It is native to China, part of Mongolia and Siberian Russia. And it was actually introduced in the United States sometime in the late 1990s in the Detroit area, where it managed to be transported on what we call dunnage, wood that is used just to hold shipments in place. And what used to happen is when the ship's offloaded, that wood would sometimes just be dumped. Well, unfortunately, that was the case here. And this insect then arrived in North America. And the problem is that this insect recognized our ash trees as suitable hosts. In other words, they're giving off volatiles and that the insect could say, that's an ash tree. But our ash trees, having never been exposed to this insect, have no defenses against it, or let's say have minimal defenses against it. So what people have discovered, of course, it doesn't matter how healthy you keep your ash tree, well, I'll water it, I'll fertilize, it'll be killed by emerald ash borer, right? So that's always our problem when we're dealing with a native insect and a non-native host, or vice versa. And so this has caused a tremendous amount of losses in South Dakota and certainly out east and now out west as well. It managed to be found in Oregon. Interesting enough, it appears to all be from the original introduction, from doing the DNA work that they do out east. In other words, we're not getting repeated introductions from China. We're getting one introduction that does appear to come from north and east of Beijing, and it's been moved all around the country and all around or many areas of Canada as well. And you only have to go through communities such as Canton and that, which unfortunately had planted far too many ash trees. And unless you're treating those trees by injection, you are going to lose them. So it'll eventually arrive in the Black Hills. Someone will carry firewood from somewhere else. A piece of firewood about the size of my forearm can have 12 adults in it. Now imagine 12 adults is all you need, more than what you need to start an infestation. So our request asks people never to move wood out of the quarantine areas, no firewood, no hardwood firewood of any species. Seems to be working. It has slowed the movement, but the inevitability is it'll probably appear there. But when we're talking bark beetles, we're talking about native insects that are in their native environment affecting their native hosts. So in this case, trees have some defenses that they can use against them, and these beetles play an important role in the ecology of the Black Hills. So it's not something that came in. It's not something that has disappeared. It is something that is always present and always will be present. Now we have three of the most for the most common. The engraver beetles, those are typically tag dying tops and branches. They also infest logging slash, and of course, down trees, which we had a lot of from that December storm, and I'll chat about that in a minute. And then we have a little bit larger beetle, the mountain pine beetle, which typically attacks trees from about 3 to 50 feet tall up to about a 5-inch top. And then the tire kickers, as we call them, the turpentine beetles, which attack the lower 3 feet of the trunk. And usually those are not serious pests. Pests by that, something that kills a tree, you'd rather have it not. They tend to go after trees that are dying, or they'll even attack fresh stumps. But guess what? Somehow that insect got introduced to China. And in China,
Mm.
it's a tree killer. In combination with the blue stain fungus. So unfortunately, international trade creates a lot of problems where we're mixing and matching trees and pests that, again, have not co-evolved together. So the defenses that the trees normally would have are not in place. Well, I will mention a few things about pine engraver. It's a very small insect, as you can see. It easy to identify for mountain pine beetle. It's a little bit smaller. It looks like somebody bit a hole out of its butt. It has that concave appearance and has points on it. Now, guess what? You can find adults any month of the year. And what they typically do is they overwinter in the duff layer. So right now, you're not going to find a lot of adults in trees, not like mountain pine beetle where you find the larvae in during the wintertime and underneath the trunk. These you quite often find in the duff layer. And if you go out when it gets warm again and you start disturbing the duff layer, you'll actually see them flying out of it. But then they go to green slash, down material that is still fresh, suitable for food for their young. That's where they'll lay eggs. Eggs will hatch and the larvae feed and then turn into pupae. And then another generation comes out, usually sometime in late May. Now, we often call them generations, but it isn't like you have one, two, three. Once they're out, you're always going to find them out for the whole summer long. So you'll start seeing this in a couple of weeks. When I was out last weekend, I still couldn't find any of this from this year. But, here we are in slash. They're just beginning to burrow in, and you see the beetle there in the center. It's creating what we call a nuptial chamber. In the case of pine engraver beetles, there's one male and about three females. And the male selects the host, starts making a little chamber there. The females come in, they all mate, and then notice every female goes her own way. I'll make a tunnel here, you make a tunnel there. And the tunnels start going out in kind of the star or X pattern. And along that, you'll find all these little galleries coming out from it, which are from their larvae. So they all lay eggs along each of their own egg galleries. And then the eggs hatch, the larvae feed out from there. And about 40 days later, they emerge and will then go to other hosts. But with this, after they hatch, and there's a little start from last year, and move out, quite often the material they were in originally is now dried sufficiently. It will not be suitable hosts. And if we're in a drought, they'll then go to standing trees. Normally they leave standing trees alone. But boy, we have a lot of down material out there. So we have a lot of food to get the population building this spring. And we have a lot of snap tops. And if we stay in a drought, this could be a bad year for losses due to IPS. Now, again, it's a native insect doing what it's always done. But if your trees are on your property and they're stressed, you may find that you have losses. By the way, in the early part of the mountain pine beetle epidemic, we actually lost more trees to pine engraver for some years than we did to mountain pine beetle. And that, so both can be major issues in terms of tree mortality. But on the other side of it, what they are nature's recyclers. They are out there taking all that slash, feeding through it, breaking it down. And so it's a recycling effort if you want to look at it. What is its role and benefit to the environment? Well, let's look at mountain pine beetle. That's the big one. Let me also mention with mountain pine beetle that what we're seeing is populations building in the northern hills. We will not see an epidemic like we just went through. There's not the stand density to support it. But if you live in the northern hills, you'll probably see populations building, particularly along Spearfish Canyon, which has a lot of large diameter trees. And so we expect to see larger pockets of hit trees up in that area. Kurt Allen, the Forest Service entomologist, and I have gone through last fall, and we can find 100-tree pockets, which are fairly large, and those tend to expand even larger. Will it go down to the southern hills as an epidemic? Not likely, but let me also say we can find mountain pine beetle throughout the entire hills. It's not that it moves, it just the population tends to explode in some areas. If you want to find it, I can find it down in Hot Springs. I can find it in Custard. I can find it in the central part of the state, and I can certainly find it in the northern hills. But the combination of stand densities in that has allowed it to expand more in the northern hills. The other term that I hate is when I hear that mountain pine beetle disappeared after the epidemic. It doesn't disappear. It's native. The population just crashed, but it's always out there. And it's always been here. There's evidence of infestations that grew quite large in the 1840s. Now, it's harder to go farther back than that. It's not as easy to look at these as it is fire history. But we do know at the turn of the previous century in the late 1800s, there was quite an outbreak that was famous as being the largest they'd ever seen. And I read about it in college in the early 70s. But it caused so much attention then. There was an expedition out there of like-minded bug people. Hopkins is the one most known, who went out and took a look at the Black Hills to try to explain why all these trees were dying from a very small insect, which was called the Black Hills beetle. And what surprised them was how quickly that population built. 1895, no infested trees. Then they started noting some by 1870, and then it blew up. And it followed tops of ridges or ran up and down slopes and then disappeared again. And again, by disappearing, the population just dropped. So we've seen this in the past. We're going to see it in the future. It is not cyclical or periodic. In other words, every 10 years the population expands. But as I'll show you, we have seen these in the past and we'll see them in the future. Well, there's Beaver Park in 1999. And what you're looking at is a lot of ponderosa pines that were killed by mountain pine beetle. Now, since a lot of people didn't see it, it really didn't get on people's radar until sometime in probably the early 2000s, 2005s, and that when people started noticing that throughout. But here's a map as best as Kurt Allen and I can look at. We went back through the records of every year. Now, some years they measured mortality in trees per acre. Some they did it as board feet per acre. Some they did it. And the problem is we had to take all this and translate it into trees per acre. And it's a rough approximation. But what I want you to notice is that epidemic that occurred around 1900 was huge. Again, it was written up right afterwards. And then we didn't see it again until about the 1940s. It started building a little bit in the 1930s, but it wasn't a very large epidemic. Tree densities were way down from that first epidemic. And then notice it popped up again in the 1950s, popped up again in 1965. Many of you might recall the one that occurred from the 1970s till about 1985. And then in the early 1990s, there was just a little blip in one area of the hills, and then it kind of faded again. And then about 2005, people noticed it, and then by 2010, you could see it almost everywhere. And I can recall people saying, this will not end until the last pine tree is dead. No, that's never happened, never will happen. But the population crashed almost as quickly as it grew. And we'll talk about that towards the end of this presentation. Why did it end? We had about 30 million trees killed during the 68 years of outbreak. And then in the other 67 years of endemic populations, we only had about a half a million. So this goes up and down, and it as it has in the past and as it will in the future. Well, what's its life cycle? Because it's different. First of all, right now they're all larvae underneath the bark of the trees, spending the winter in a little bit of suspended animation, if you will. They can tolerate fairly cold temperatures during this time period, but come the spring and summer, they'll pupate, turn a little white underneath the bark, and then in late July, they'll become adults. And you'll find them underneath the bark for a little while as adults. And then they start to emerge. And they start to emerge in mass. And the reason they do that is they attack healthy trees. And healthy trees have excellent defenses. It's a good example, as I say, one wolf will not take down a moose, but five wolves will. It's the same with mountain pine beetle. One mountain pine beetle won't kill a tree. In fact, five won't either. But they literally have to attack the tree by the hundreds or thousands in order to overcome the defenses and attack a tree. And the reward for attacking a healthy tree is an excellent food source for your larvae, one that's going to have a lot of sugars in it, which you need for them to grow to then become healthy adults as well. And the way it works, and that's my drawing of a tree, if you will, the pioneering female initiates the host finding. She decides what tree to attack. Usually the focus tree is going to be a larger diameter tree that in the beginning is slightly stressed. In other words, maybe it's not going to produce sap quite as well as some of the others. It's going to burrow through that sap. In other words, it can overcome the defenses. Now, when I say this female, there's going to be a lot of them at the same time attacking the tree. But the female will release a pheromone, a calling card, if you will, that calls in males and other females that will then come into the tree. And the female will attract a male. They can, I won't say they mate for life, but nevertheless, what we have is two now that will mate, and she will lay eggs along a single egg gallery. So this is different from the pine engraver, where you'll find one male and perhaps three females, and they'll all go off their separate ways. She'll make one long tunnel there, and she'll lay eggs along it as she burrows along, again, fighting the sap as well. But the eggs are laid along it, and then when the eggs hatch, those larvae will form a small tunnel kind of perpendicular to the original one. And there's a larvae about the size of a rice grain. Now, there has to be a lot of them attacking the tree to overcome the defenses. You don't want the sap to kill all your young there. If you got a lot of them attacking, they can overcome the sap flow and they'll burrow out, make their own little tunnels there, and feed very happily, become pupae the following spring, and then emerge as adults and attack another tree. Because with mountain pine beetle, they kill their host. In other words, everybody that attacks that tree in late summer, by the following year, when the new adults emerge, the tree is dead. It can no longer remain a suitable host. And the tree also becomes infected with blue stain fungi. And the blue stain fungi and mountain pine beetle work together to kill the tree fairly quickly. There's always debate what kills it, what kills a tree more. Is it the beetle or the fungus? And you get arguments on either side, but it really doesn't matter because in nature, they're always found together. They always work together. The beetles literally carry the fungus with them to a new host. The fungus also helps reduce the sap flow. The beetles also feed on the fungus at a certain point as well. So it's a beneficial relationship for both. The beetles carry the fungus to a new host. That's how they get around. And the beetles benefit because they also help to kill the tree and provide a lunch as well. And so you'll find that stain in it. Now, what was interesting is, as a side note, that blue stain, when it got into the trees, dries out the trees very quickly. The wood's not sappy, it's light, and it has this color. And a lot of people were going, well, what can we do with this wood? And there's a lot of places that would not take the wood because people said, well, that's mold. And then somebody came up and called it denim pine, kind of like denim jeans. And there were actually people looking to buy blue stain wood. Structurally, it's sound, but some people just did not like the color in that. Well, now here's the other interesting thing. Once too many beetles come to the tree, okay, I'm coming. Let's go there. Let's go there. Let's go there. Once you get too many beetles coming to the tree, they all release another chemical and say, hey, this tree's full. No vacancy. Go find another tree. That to me is amazing. Okay, well, I'm going to attract everybody to this tree to help overcome its defenses. We all attack it together, we will win. But we can't have too many attack it. Otherwise, there won't be enough food for all our kids. So once they reach the carrying capacity of the tree, they release a chemical telling everybody, go find another tree. Because once you're full, you don't have enough for everybody to survive. And these trees can be packed with larvae. So what happens is we do get some that, okay, let's attack that tree, the focus tree, and they'll all come in to attack it. But at a certain point, it's going to be full. And so other beetles then start saying, well, I'll go to that one. Oh, we'll go to that one. Oh, well, maybe we'll go to that one again. And then maybe one will attack this one. And so what you find is they start expanding out. The original tree is full, so they'll en masse attack surrounding trees. That's why we often find pockets of infested trees rather than just a single infested tree. All the carryover attacks now start going to the surrounding trees, so you get this expanding pockets. And again, that's very common. We're seeing that in the northern hills in some areas as well. Well, there's 4 stages to this epidemic, if you will. All right, we have endemic and we go to epidemic. They're in endemic populations when the mortality is less than 1 tree per acre or 1 tree per 5 acres. Now, they had to come up with a number, and I'm not so much focused on the number as the fact that we always have mountain pine beetle out there. It's throughout the entire Black Hills, and it's always killing trees. But during endemic, they're just picking on a small tree here or there. but it's easy to find them. And when we're hiking through the woods, we can find, oh yeah, that tree was attacked. And we've settled on this as a definition. So when we're talking, we can say, well, that's what we mean by endemic. Now, then it starts building. And in this case, they look at as tree mortality greater than one tree per acre, but less than 10% of the stand infested over a 3-year period. Um, the importance of this is just so entomologists can talk to each other and say, well, what do we mean in terms of density? But with these, what we start finding is now we're losing more and more trees. The size gets bigger every year, and it keeps growing every year. And they often occur at about the same time. Drought is a beginning factor. It's a trigger for a start of having the expansion where we start losing groupings of trees rather than just individual trees. And what happens in there when they start coalescing all these little pockets into big pockets, that's when we say the epidemic phase has begun. That we're no longer losing small pockets of trees, we're losing large pockets, literally hundreds and hundreds of trees within an area. And as I pointed out here, tree mortality can increase tenfold. And so this keeps going for several years, but then it ends, and they end rather abruptly. Suddenly it drops, and it goes back to an endemic state. Now, the interesting thing with it doesn't, we don't lose ponderosa pines. Every cone that came down, we're going to have seedlings come up, and you get a new stand coming back very quickly. In fact, within a few years of the end of the epidemic, there were stands that Kurt and I would walk through 5 feet apart. We couldn't see each other because the regeneration was that quick. And there's a good example of our losses during the last epidemic. 1995, yep, little pockets here and there, but starting to build. 2000, yeah, a little bit bigger pockets. They're starting to coalesce. By 2005, absolutely, we were starting to pockets increase. And then look at peaked by 2012. And by peak, that was our highest year of tree mortality, if you will. And then look how quickly it dropped. By 2015, it was essentially over. Despite the fact we still had large diameter trees out there, we still had some dense stands, but we had far fewer of them. And so this is the way we look at it. Endemic, too small, can't kill large trees, but then it shifts from attacking weakened hosts to large healthy trees because you have the number to do it. And then they're overcoming large trees at the landscape level, and then it drops. They're no longer able to kill the moose. They're no longer able to kill large trees, and we're back to them going after the weak. Well, what's a beetle need for an outbreak? Needs favorable weather, and we'll talk about that. Then you got to have a host. So winter cold, will winter cold reduce populations? It can. They can tolerate temperatures to about -10 in autumn, -25 or even lower in midwinter, -30 you can need. And remember, it's got to get that below the bark where they're at. So when we're talking about an air temperature, it certainly has to be colder than that. But why the winters don't often get cold enough to kill them, sometimes the springs and falls can, because they can't tolerate as cold during those time periods. When we looked at that entire time period from 1900 to 2015, looking at the weather records that we have in the Black Hills, you can take a look and notice our winters have become warmer. And I've heard people say and write that, yeah, we're kind of losing this as a factor, and they may be correct. We're not experiencing those deep colds that can reduce the population as easily. Now, if we look at that seasonal that we get cold weather right away, we did get those. And I want you to notice at the end of the last epidemic, now, by the way, it was already dropping, but we hit that -15 in March, and that can drop the population even more. We had a little buildup there about 1991 in one area, but we got minus 11 in October, and that ended up pushing the population down. So winter cold, but more importantly, unusual temperature fluctuations in spring and fall can help reduce the mountain pine beetle population. But as I said, our winters are getting warmer. But our March temperatures, we're still getting those ups and downs enough that it might. And look at the weather we're getting. It gets warm one week, and then the temperatures plummet the next week. So the shoulders of the winter seasons, the Octobers and March, still can play a role in reducing populations, probably more so than our January temperatures. Well, summer heat. Well, let me tell you right now, that's not a major factor. The beetle can tolerate our summer warmth just fine. In fact, if our summers were cooler, that might be a problem. But as warm as they are, our beetles can handle it just fine. And we don't see really any correlation between summer temperatures and tree mortality. But we do with drought. Now, again, mountain pine beetle does go for healthy trees. But what we noticed, and others have noticed before as well, that the trigger for an epidemic is having several years of drought. Now, again, that in it alone is not going to start an epidemic. You need to have enough trees as well. But if we have several periods, several years of drought, what that does is it stresses the trees enough that the beetles can start picking on some big trees. And if they win in the big trees, we've built up their population, and now they'll move to other trees. What was interesting is once that population starts to expand, it doesn't matter if we go back to wet years. The population's high enough, it can attack healthy trees and would prefer to attack healthy trees because they're going to be more suitable hosts for their young. But to kick it off, a little bit of drought helps. And what we found is about a 1 year lag. One or two, you get a drought, and guess what happens? If you've got enough trees, then we start seeing the population expand. And we saw that with the last one. Remember the droughts we were getting in the 90s, which were then followed by some wet years, but we'd already start that population building up. And again, if we take a look at the Palmer Drought Index then and look at over the years, it matches up fairly well with the mountain pine beetle. So what do we need? We need drought. We need thirsty trees. But then we need a lot of large diameter trees. So that's the other thing. Do we have an abundance of suitable hosts? If we don't, we can't build a population again. So we need lots of them, and we need a lot of large ones. In fact, they have to be at least 10 inches DBH, at least. Now, that's not a large tree. I'm sure a lot of you would agree. But nevertheless, we got to have them that big. If the trees are 8 inches in diameter, you don't have them big enough to have that many come out as went in. And that. So the smaller trees can be attacked, but they can't sustain an outbreak. So one of the things is, as you reduce the size of your trees, you're going to reduce the population that's emerging from those trees, which means you're not going to have a big buildup of beetles to attack other trees. What you really need are the 14, 15, 20, 25-inch trees. Look at this. They have, compared to a 10-inch tree, a 14-inch tree can have 3 times the net production of beetles. 20-inch trees out there are what we called motherships. You can get a tremendous number of beetles that emerge from those trees. And so the more large trees you have that are attacked, okay, the quicker that population of beetles can build. And if you look, we look at, okay, well, how many attack a tree? 5 to 10 per square foot. And then you take a look at how many are in there as eggs and how many are in there as larvae. And again, a lot of them die. Disease, environment, even sap flow. But notice here, emerging adults, if you had 5 to 10 per attack, and then you have 6 to 50 for coming out, well, you notice if you got a large diameter tree and you've got 10 per square foot, but your emerging is 50 per square foot, that's 5 times the population. An 11-inch tree is killed by about, what, 500 to 1,000? And a 15-inch tree, again, look at the population, it goes up again. And that's what went in. Think of what comes out. Well, the other thing is, what about the density of those trees? What role does that play? Not only the number of them out there, but how dense the stands are. You can see here quite a difference of stands here from one side to the other, and the beetles prefer dense stands. They have their best success in those stands. And so that's where thinning came about. And I'm not going to be talking about it from a management standpoint, but just as a stand density. And if we look at thinning, which has always been kind of well, this is the go-to, why do people look at how it works? And again, is it perfect? Of course not. Does it always work? No. Are there a lot of other factors considered? Absolutely yes. But let's look at just density or the density, the spacing. Well, you know what? A lot of people look at it, well, if I have fewer trees, they're healthier. Yeah, you could say that. But the beetle likes to attack healthy trees. So how much of a role does that play? It plays some, I'm sure. But the other is they're looking at is consider what happens to the microenvironment, that it makes it less suitable for the beetles as another factor. And remember, they depend on everybody attacking at once. Within 4 or 5 days, remember, they release that chemical. Everybody attack now. Because if you don't, beetles are going to lose. Okay, they're going to be pushed out by that sap and killed. I need enough beetles attacking in a short time period to overcome the defenses. Well, think of it. I'm a beetle and I'm releasing a chemical and calling in other beetles. If you've got a more open stand, you've got more air movement. And with more air movement, that is going to disperse. And I may not be able to find where everybody's being pulled to. The mountain pine beetle is a good flyer, but it's not a fast flyer. And David Letterman at Colorado State phrased it best. At about 4 miles an hour, they're surfing, not flying. In other words, they're being pushed around a little bit more. So you don't need very high wind speeds going through the forest to kind of disrupt that communication system of everyone trying to find a tree in a relatively short time period. The other thing is a more open stand, you're going to get more of that soil being warmed, which means you're going to get warm air being lifted up, and that can end up dispersing beetles in a farther area rather than concentrating them. So what they've looked at is the fact that if we have more open stands, that what that does is that makes it more challenging for the beetles with their communication system to find certain trees and attack them in mass, plus to navigate around in the canopy of the tree rather than being pushed up above it. In fact, what they find here is that convections caused by midday heating gets the beetles carried up by updrafts. And they kind of surf the drafts by folding their wings and then dropping and then opening them again. It's not an active flight. In other words, they're not trying to fly to something, but they can actually be carried in some cases considerable distances. There is that one flight from Colorado that ended up in the panhandle of Nebraska, much to the dismay of the beetles who dropped in and go, "Where are the pine trees?" But not a lot of them are carried this way, maybe 2 to 3%. But nevertheless, more open stands, it's harder to do that mass attack. And so we find that you capturing the beetles, but guess what? We're not getting the mortality. And so open stands, more dispersal, fewer mass attacks, again, to a degree based upon the air flow. Certainly can be the health of the trees as well. And what's interesting is when we took a look at stands, and we were measuring stands in Custer State Park, and we were also measuring stands in Black Elk. So we went out there and we're measuring them, and we've got a lot of data from it, of course. And you look, but we started out here and in Custer State Park, the managed side, the Black Elk, unmanaged by intent to let natural forces occur, which is always valuable. and look at the number of trees per acre, TPA, in the basal area. In other words, kind of the density. How many trees do we have? Fairly similar, but at the end, now on the Custer State Park side, they went out there and thinned the trees. Now they lost trees to mountain pine beetle too, no question. But between the two, trees that they removed that were infested and trees they removed to reduce density, at the end, we had about 61 trees per acre, basal area of about 65. In the wilderness area, we were down to about 31 trees per acre and a basal area of about 22. Now, there's two things I want to point out here is why it can happen that mountain pine beetle just takes out every tree. It doesn't work that way. If you go up through the wilderness area and actually count live large trees, they're still out there. There's just fewer of them, but it didn't eliminate them. In other words, the beetle killed enough trees, it reduced the stand density itself. So you had a more open forest, particularly as the dead trees now started to fall. On the Custer State Park side, they got an open stand as well. But that they did it by cutting down the trees that were infested and then thinning some beyond it. But in both sides, what you get is a reduction in density. Okay, reduction in the number of large trees, a more open stand, and it's less conducive to the beetles. One or two ways, it'll work. And you can see a number of papers, this being one that was published in 2017, showing very similar to what I just explained with the wilderness area. Well, does anything else influence outbreaks? Well, certainly. Probably more factors than we know, to be honest with you. Epidemics, by the time an epidemic ends, everybody's thinking of new questions to ask, and you got to wait for the next one. But there are natural enemies out there that feed on mountain pine beetle. And they also have competitors. One of the things that we noticed, and they noticed this in Colorado as well, at the beginning of the epidemic, you would find that mountain pine beetle would kill the tree, and that following summer, in other words, now the tree's dead, they're all leaving, Sawyer beetles would attack it because they can go after dead and dying trees, after fires, for example. Towards the end of the epidemic, Sawyer beetles were attacking the same trees mountain pine beetles were within days. In other words, in the late summer, when mountain pine beetles said, let's all attack this tree, within weeks, you'd find Sawyer beetles were attacking the exact same trees. And Sawyer beetles eat more and faster. And so essentially, they were going through the trees quicker than mountain pine beetle could. And several of us have looked at, was this a competitive factor? Is that another factor that caused the epidemic to end? And so starts of epidemics, relatively simple. We got to have a couple of years of drought in order to allow some of the bigger trees to be stressed enough that mountain pine beetle can attack it. And then what we need is enough fuel. In other words, we need to have large trees the population can build in, and we need to have dense stands, at least a pocket of a dense stand, so the population can build and then start to move. Once the population starts increasing, you can have wet weather, that's fine. You can have smaller diameter trees, that's fine. But then at a certain point, it begins to end. Now, that may be a reduction in stand density enough over a landscape level, a reduction in tree diameter over a landscape level. There could be viral diseases we don't even know about that play a factor, as well as what we saw, and that is that some other insects were also attacking the same tree and reducing its suitability for mountain pine beetle. So that's it. I wanted to make sure I didn't talk for a complete hour. As faculty, we tend to talk in 50-minute increments. And if I was a little long-winded, I do apologize. If there are questions or discussion, It's not like we have all the answers on this. We always end up with more questions than answers. But I'm certainly happy to entertain any discussion on any of the bark beetles that we find out in the Black Hills.
Great. And I know we've got questions. Maybe start, Dr. Ball, with the two that are in the chat from George.
All right, let me look at the chat here.
Can you see those?
Yes, I
And then
can.
we've already got a couple out here in the audience too. So
All right. Um, you know what? It's kind of interesting with blue stain, and there's a couple things to that. And that is we call them blue stain fungi, but there's different species of fungi. In generally speaking, no. If I've got it here, no. The lignin does remain. Again, most of them we don't see a change in wood quality at all. For our use in terms of wood quality, we're giving human characteristics to it now. But what it does is just dry it out tremendously fast. By the way, that was a negative for loggers. That if you're being paid by the load, by the weight, you were cutting the same number of trees, but the weight just plummeted. And then again, also the market, just because people feared it. What's the range of mountain pine beetle? Dendroctonus ponderosa, is that the right scientific name to look it up? Yes, but let me add this, and this is kind of interesting. Mountain pine beetle is found from the Black Hills all the way to California, all the way down to Mexico, and all the way up to British Columbia and that. That's a huge range. And mountain pine beetle in the Black Hills is isolated. In other words, I can't go from the Black Hills and get in a car and keep driving and always find mountain pine beetle all the way till I get the front range. Because of that, our mountain pine beetles are different than the mountain pine beetles found in California. Okay, ours are bigger. In fact, as I say, they used to be a separate species, the Black Hills beetle. And you might say, well, why does that matter? It matters in that they speak different dialects, that pheromone communication system's a little different. And here's what I mean. That remember I mentioned they produce a pheromone, interspecies communication that says this tree's full. Go find another tree. Well, they synthesize that in a pouch, and you can staple that on a pine tree, and it releases that volatile. And in theory, the beetles will come to that and say, oh, this tree is full, and go find another tree. We've tested, by we, Forest Service, myself, have tested every one of those pouches that it came out throughout the entire epidemic. None of them worked in the Black Hills, not on ponderosa pine. Our ponderosa pines are a little different too, and it's a collection of those volatiles. Those same products work well in Idaho. Some work great in California. But again, our dialect is a little different. And they developed the products based on the California beetles, apparently. And so when we staple them to trees here, it does not work at all. So yeah, look it up for mountain pine beetle, and almost everything you read will fit. But like most things, local source is best, and you will find some information from the Black Hills that will be a little different from the information you read from, let's say, California or Idaho or even Western Montana. Okay, I think I see another message here. Yes, George, to everyone, you mentioned about the wood strength. Any peer-reviewed papers? Yes, there are. Can I mention them off the top of my head? No, I cannot. I'm not a forest engineer, but there are the papers. And George, I do have my email address right there on the last slide. If you'll email me or just text me your email if you prefer, I'll be more than happy to pull those papers up and send you them. It will not be in the next week. The next week I am traveling, literally tomorrow. and then back at the end of next week. So it's not something I can pull together tonight before I go home. But yes, more than happy to send you any of that information because it's a great question. Why did the drought during 1930? Oh, you know what's interesting about that one? And that's a great question. Here we had the drought. But if you also go back at the publications in that time period when they were out there doing inventories and that, we didn't have the stand density. That so many trees were lost in the 1890s. And of course, there was still a lot of logging going on. And then we were in a drought that we just didn't have the fuels, if you will, widespread across the entire hills to really push a very large epidemic. It was this think of it at the end of the 1930s, that dry period, we had the smallest of the epidemic. It could get it started, but we didn't have the density to keep it going. Great question. I love that.
And we have someone in the audience. If you say it from there, it'll reach you, David.
Okay.
So,
So unlike you, I was not charting the uh, epidemic as it was hitting, but it seems to me like simultaneously we had the Winter Olympics and the blue buildings in British Columbia. Down at Grand Lake in Colorado, we had the massive kill-offs on the tree sides, and we had it here. Were those actually associated in time, or is it just that for some reason we became aware of it and it seemed to be everywhere at once?
Wow. Great.
so was it a continent-wide drought
Yeah.
that
I want you
triggered?
all to take my classes, please. You have great questions. I like, and you're not saying, well, Dr. Balls, it's just going to be on the exam. But you're right that notice it was throughout the entire West. It wasn't that we have an epidemic in South Dakota and then they have one somewhere else. What they look at is a couple of things. First of all, we did have some episodes of drought throughout all this western area. And we had fairly high stand densities. The densities in the Black Hills were at historical high levels. Bill Shop, a Forest Service entomologist in the Black Hills, I think said it best. We didn't have an epidemic of beetles, we had an epidemic of trees. And they found that throughout the West. And so I think we just had the perfect storm in terms of conditions to allow them to start. And then, of course, the fuels. I might also add that throughout the West, it's not just ponderosa pine that are host to mountain pine beetle. It's also lodgepole pine. And of course, we lost a lot of those. Now, the interesting thing is I also read a lot, as I'm sure some did as well, that, oh my gosh, all these droughts, we're going to lose all the trees. And no, we didn't. The interesting question to me is, and I don't have an answer for you, is other than we believe, note my phrasing, we don't have hard data to support it, but it appears that, okay, once we reduce stand densities, the bug population drops. So are we going to be able to have enough fuels? And then these other factors, we don't know what role viral diseases may have had, if any, or competition in that. To me, there's the unknown. Why did it end? Is it just because we lost enough trees that you couldn't build it up anymore? Or are there other factors out there that we don't understand yet or understand well? So we'll wait to the next one. Oh,
Go ahead and shout it out. We've got another question here.
yeah.
Did the, did
Oh, go
the
ahead.
cut and chunk method ever do anything really to reduce the number of trees spread or the beetle spread during the epidemic?
Yes. I have data on that here at graduate student work on it. Didn't make it part of the presentation, but for those that are not aware of what became called cut and chunk, I don't even know where that popped up, but it stuck. And what it was a solar treatment. We've always known solar treatments can be effective. In other words, you take an infested tree, you cut it down, You cover it with plastic, rotate the wood so you heat it up, and you kill a lot of beetles. And it's not because you're covering it with plastic, it's just that you've created conditions to kill a lot of beetles. Well, what we looked at was, what if we've got an isolated stand that we can't go out and rotate and cover in plastic? Is just cutting the trees into short chunks without rotation. Will that kill enough beetles in isolated pockets that they will not expand? And the answer to that is yes. But here's the important part of it. If you have a stand of, let's say, 15 trees that are infested, it almost doesn't matter what you do. And I say that because when Kurt and I looked at that, sometimes the beetles just disperse from that and they don't expand at all. So what we found is, and what it was looked at, is if you had small isolated pockets, 20 trees, 30 trees, 40 trees, and you went out in the fall, okay, October, September, even better, and you cut those infested trees down and cut them in 2-foot lengths and separated them, you'd kill a lot of beetles. We collected that every month, and then what we found is that it didn't expand. And in the study, what we did is we took stands to which nothing was done and stands to which cutting and chunking was done and compared them. And guess what? It worked. But when you started going more than that, hey, we're going to cut 200 trees. We're going to cut 500 trees. No, you still had enough beetles that it was not going to work, and it wasn't designed to work in those. So it was, to me, a good and appropriate technique, but within the limitations to what it was designed for. So large scale, no, it's not a treatment that has value. Where it had value was isolated pockets that you didn't want to see expand, that if you could go back out there in the fall, cut the trees, separate them, that yes, on those small 30 tree pockets, you'd come back, they did not expand. You killed enough beetles that you weren't getting the expansion. And we've got good data on that. But the large ones, no, not at all.
Any other questions out here, Jay?
What are the effects of thinning slash, especially for like imps?
Okay, I'm sorry. I heard ips and slash. Could you say that again, please?
What's the effect of thinning slash?
Thinning
Oh, yeah.
slash.
Okay. Yeah, of thinning the trees and the slash from that on ips. Well, it depends on when. What we recommend, and now we're getting into management, that if you're out there thinning trees, for fire or some other use, that you want to cut those trees, pile the slash, or spread the slash, lop and scatter. But you want to have that done before the end of January. In fact, around Christmas and that. And the reason for that is you want that wood to dry out so it's not a suitable host for the beetles to infest that spring or have them mature. The worst time, and I have seen this, is somebody goes out and they thin out trees in April, for example, or April or March, and they leave a lot of slash. That slash is very attractive to the adult beetles when they start emerging from the duff in April, and they get through it. They have a lot of babies. They all live. But when they emerge, the only thing they can go to are standing trees. So when you create the slash is critical in terms of, will that cause a buildup of engraver beetles, Ips beetles, and then they go to healthy trees or not? But there's one other factor too. The Sawyer beetle, excuse me, the Ips beetles, the pine engraver beetles, success is on trees that are stressed. If they're healthy, They just can't make it. And so what you also need is a drought. Now, here's the important thing. If we have a wet spring, and we've had them, you can almost get away with anything. And I don't recommend that. But, people said, well, gee, we cut the slash and piled it up and we didn't lose any trees. Well, that was a wet year. The trees were super healthy. But then they tried that, and I think it was in 2001 in that, where it was a drought. And oh my gosh, you could spot where they'd had slash piles by looking at all the standing dead trees. So if we have normal precipitation in April, May, and June, those are the 3 critical months, trees are usually healthy enough that they won't be attacked. But if we have a drought, and if you have green slash out there late winter, so it's attractive for the beetles when they emerge, but after that it's dried out, well, the ips are going to go to the standing trees that are stressed, and that's where you get ips being a tree killer. Oh, how long does mountain pine beetles survive in log and firewood? Oh, that's a good question. These are all good questions. And by the way, ips can as well, but they don't typically overwinter in the wood. Is if you cut the tree down in the winter, for example, and the beetles are in it, and you stack it, especially if you stack it, what's going to happen is it stays moist enough, they might be able to finish their development and emerge. If you cut the firewood in the spring, absolutely they're still going to emerge. So it's not a real strong relationship, and firewood will not be attacked by the mountain pine beetle. But yes, if you cut it in the spring when the larvae are just about finished with their feeding, they'll still emerge from adult from that wood in July.
Okay, any other questions here? And I do online see one about, is the mountain pine beetle part of the natural forest cycle or normal forest cycle?
Yeah, I would say
I
yes,
guess it is, yeah.
but I wouldn't call it a cycle, because a cycle implies periodic, that every 10 years goes up, every 20 years it goes up. No, I think it's one of our population regulating factors, just like fire.
And I've got a question.
Yeah.
What about the pine trees? Do they develop a genetic resistance if they survive? If they're the survivors in a stand, and if they're the ones that reproduce, are they creating a generation of pines that are, I guess it would have to do with the sap flow.
Yeah, right now. Yeah, say that
And
10 times
genetically,
fast.
some have more than others, or is that not a thing?
No, that's a very interesting thing. And in fact, Montana, they looked at that. And again, like most research, it kind of fades away when we start losing infested trees. And one of the things that was being advocated is, well, wait a minute, if you're out thinning trees, open up stands, how do you know you're cutting down the trees that do not have this genetic superiority? In other words, there's some trees that survive. And so there may be something to it, but we don't have enough data on that yet. Plus, you also have to notice this, that think of the Black Hills. How many trees were lost in this epidemic that survived the epidemic in the 1970s as large trees, and the epidemic in the 1960s? And so I don't think it's a perfect relationship that all the trees that survive this epidemic will not be attacked on the next epidemic. It's not an immunity thing that we develop, perhaps. There's probably something to it, but no, it's not perfect, because we lost lots of we've lost 200 years old trees. How many epidemics did those trees survive? So is it a factor? Yes. Why they made it, I don't know, but I will not use the word random. My PhD advisor said anytime we call something random, it's because we don't understand it. So let's just say more work's got to be done to answer the question that you asked.
So any other questions here in the room? And I don't see any online. Dr. Ball, you've been very generous with your time. We've enjoyed this very much. Thank you for talking tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you for the invitation. I hope you found it entertaining and informative. It probably left you with more questions than answers. If that's the case, I did my job. In that, there's a lot still to know. There is my email address and my cell phone number, which I do respond to texts and while I'll be out for the next week traveling and not able to check it quite as frequently as I'd like, um, please, if you have any additional questions, do not hesitate to email me or text me, and I will be happy to answer any questions you have on this. So with that, I will let you all go this evening. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you.
Paul. Thank you.